Welcome to Moving Medicine Forward, a podcast presented by CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. This podcast is centered on advancements in healthcare and elevating individual stories and their expertise. I'm your host, Jeremy Schran, and together with my co-host, Raina Graham,
hello,
we will take you through a deep dive of CTI, clinical research, the patient journey, and much more. Today, for our very first episode, we will be talking with Christine Eby, who is the Director of Clinical Project Management and also the Therapeutic Lead for Rare Disease here at CTI. She will be sharing her son's patient journey as her family navigates his type 1 diabetes diagnosis. So let's get started. Welcome to the podcast, Christine. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about your patient journey and how your family has dealt with a chronic disease.
Yeah. So my background is in the disease space. So this has affected me a little bit differently than maybe others. I'm sure other families out there have different or similar experiences. But what happened with our family is that my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 3 years ago. And diabetes is not a rare disease, which is where I feel most comfortable. So this is maybe why this journey has been so difficult for me, is because it has really just opened up my eyes to a whole different side of our industry and what other patients go through. And what I mean by that is, like, with rare disease, we're usually dealing with, very acute and emergent situations, and it's kind of all hands on deck. And with chronic disease, it comes to more the realization that this is going to be our entire life of this. So it really kind of is, it goes through a lot of different stages, but like just accepting that this is now our life is different than I thought I would ever have to encounter.
So what made you realize that your son might be showing signs of type 1?
So I am fortunate that my son was showing the very hallmark signs of diabetes. And since my history is in treating pediatrics, I was maybe a little bit more sensitive, or my husband would probably say neurotic about that. So he was exhibiting the 3 hallmark signs, and that is having to urinate a lot. He was very thirsty and very hungry when he's traditionally a really picky eater, and he was very tired, would come home from daycare and would take a nap right away. So it was pretty in your face to not see it.
So what were some of your initial concerns and fears when you were working through this process and trying to figure out what this would look like for your son and how this would change your life?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I really, really underestimated how things would change. Looking back, I think I was kind of already in denial because I was noticing symptoms in December, and it was right around the holidays, and I was just really kind of putting it off a little bit. And then I would talk to people, and they're just like, no, that's crazy. So looking back, it was a little bit different. So I put it off until January to even go in for the diagnosis, because in my heart, I knew, like, once I go in for this appointment, the world is never going to be the same for me. So I think in retrospect, I was in denial. And I was just totally underestimated this entire disease space. I mean, of course, I have friends with children with diabetes, and I've treated children who have had diabetes. It was way different than what I actually had to deal with.
How was it for your son? What was, he's younger, so how is it impacting him from a patient perspective? I know you see both sides working at CTI and seeing the background of a clinical trial and that patient journey perspective, but then being a parent and watching your son go through it as a patient.
So that's interesting too, because he was diagnosed in 2021 and in the hospital setting, that was still pretty strong COVID. So he was diagnosed, this is a pretty traditional diagnosis, is that patients are seen with their pediatrician, and then pediatrician directly admit them to the hospital. So I went to my pediatrician first, and this is kind of funny too. I went to the pediatrician first, and I knew the doctor I was supposed to see, and they brought us in a room, and they pricked his finger, and I kind of looked over and I saw the number, but I was like, that must be an error. And then I heard, like, talking in the hallway, and a different doctor came in. So the different doctor came in to give me the news. Yeah. So I knew, like, what to expect from that side of it. But being during COVID, when we got to the hospital, Cincinnati Children's is a wonderful facility. They are so patient-centric. Their whole child life department, they are very much focused on the patient. But during COVID, a lot of those services were shut down. So we were directly admitted to the ER, which is, again, very traditional. And that's usually a kind of a chaotic setting. But once you go up from the floor, it's a lot calmer. So we were in the emergency room. He was immediately given an IV. And that's not fun for anyone. I mean, he got it and he was fine. But also, in retrospect, he was really so tired because of the diabetes, he didn't fight it as much. He just kind of took it and just really just was like, fine, I'm here. I'll just take this. And then we got on the floor by the evening that night. So the first night was a bit of a blur, but the next day it was a very different experience. You know, you would usually have child life coming in and a lot more visitors to be able to come up right away. And it was a little bit more sterile, not a fault of the hospital. It's just they couldn't even have like their rec rooms open and things like that. So that was a little bit different. And not having visitors is different too, because I have 3 other children. So my husband had to go home that night and then wake up with the kids. But my family's all in town, but they couldn't even come and at least just sit there and do something. So it was a little bit more of an isolated experience. But from him, he still had the IV in his arm, but he just enjoyed being able to just watch TV the entire time he was laying there. So he did enjoy that part.
Right. So it's good to also realize, you know, sometimes these diagnoses are big and scary, but the kids don't always aren't at the same level as the adults, so that you have to take into account the caregivers and maybe tailoring some of the direction towards them and making sure they understand the clinical trial or the care process the most, because that's who's really taking in this diagnosis.
Yes. And at Children's, they do have a very standard practice. So, and they kind of told me this in the evening, so I knew what to expect. But pretty much like your first morning in the hospital, they start with your entire team. So it's about 12 professionals in the room. There's a dietitian, there's endocrinologists, there's all different disciplines in the room. And then you immediately start with training for about 4 hours that day with a nurse educator. So in that environment, my son was also in the room because he couldn't go to those rec rooms. So by that time, he was like, this feels like school and stuff. So that was a little bit different experience, I'm sure, for the people doing education too, to have the child right there in the room. Usually it can be a little bit distracted and stuff.
And you talked about underestimating the amount that would go into this care. How many hours do you think it took to develop a plan for your son and kind of figure out which direction, work with the team at Children's to come up with the next steps and the process moving forward?
Yeah. Oh my God. Still 3 years later. But in the moment, and I was very aware, I mean, they knew my backgrounds, but I was very aware, like, I am really like very overwhelmed by this. Please talk to me as if you would a parent who's never worked here before and who's never treated children. And so it took me a long time to understand it because I underestimated it so much. I really thought that diabetes is manageable. I knew it wasn't curable, but I just thought it was an easier fix once you kind of got all your prescriptions filled. Mm-hmm. And it was not that at all. So it took me, that first day was really, really hard because it was really starting to hit me like, so with diabetes, every time a child or anyone eats a carbohydrate, they need insulin to cover that. Not just the sugar, but like wheat bread and apple, anything with any kind of carbohydrate in it that will turn into glucose in your body. You need insulin to cover that. And kids, I mean, he was 3. You want them eating, all day. He snacks all day. So it was definitely a change of mindset of like, oh my gosh, every time he eats, I need to do a math equation and have syringes and medicine and emergency care all in place. So it took me a lot. The first day was a lot. So we were in the hospital for 2 full days to get the education.
Yeah, it seems like it could be very, very overwhelming to kind of hit that, like to deal with all those things and all that training, especially the age of your son. Like that's a lot.
Yeah.
So keep with that in mind, like how, like I know, like sometimes from a clinical trial perspective, we're looking at the numbers, we're looking at all the data. We aren't really thinking about the people on a day to day, and like as it comes along. So how does that affect how you now approach your job and approach your work, being that you've dealt with this firsthand?
Yes, so different. So, and I think back to when I was in clinic, and I'm trained to medically interview and to counsel patients in my everyday life. And I think back to probably the awful approaches I must have taken with these families now being on this side of it. I mean, I hope I grew a little bit while I was a clinician, but it is much different because diabetes is a pretty objective disease. I mean, the success is measured by your A1C level. So that's a lab value. So if that is within normal range, they consider that to be successfully managed. It can take years to get that to a place that is considered normal on paper. And that changes throughout someone's life too. Kids go through puberty, things change. Your insulin might change and your life changes. So that was really hard for me to accept as, that number being success, because That's just not possible. And my history is working with children with significant disabilities. So I'm always on the mindset, even with my own children, that there is more of a whole child approach so kind of take more baby steps. And I was very open with my care team too, very open with how I want it to be kind of spoke to as well. So I told them kind of upfront, I know how you'll document this in my chart. That is totally fine. But in this space, I really need to be on the same page with what our goals are for him. And it's, in my mind, it's okay if it takes us a lot longer to get to the objective, successful factor that you all consider success. So I think that every time I talk with the team, they really do keep that in mind and really start at my pace every time, still 3 years later.
Right. And how has that then impacted how you approach in your work in CTI? And, we're working with sites. How do you get the site to see that it's more than just the diagnosis?
Yes.
It's the patient, it's the patient's family, it's the journey that they're going on, whether it's chronic or rare or a clinical study or just current care. How do you change that perspective?
Yeah, so this was kind of eye-opening too. And again, makes me think some of the past training I've done here or just conversations I've had. So right around this time, we happened to be working with a lot of sponsors who were working in rare chronic disease. So it was still in my rare disease space, but it was chronic. And that it just kind of hit me differently because I'm usually in the space of these awful degenerative diseases that you go quickly and the child passes away. This is a different situation where it's still an awful diagnosis, but the children are still, they grow up and they grow chronologically, but not developmentally. And I just never put it together. So having this experience, my perspective is a little bit different when I talk to the CTI team as well as our site teams, because they really do have to have a different approach with the families. I mean, yes, when they're coming in for a clinical trial, the family is very focused on a treatment for a disease, even if it's experimental or not. But when they come in that day, the site team needs to realize that a lot might have happened in the last 24 hours. When you're chronically managing your own child, they might be on a trach or a vent or a feeding tube, and that's 24-hour care. And these families have accepted it as their life, but it's exhausting. And I mean, I know for myself, I have a bad temper as it is. I mean, so being sleep deprived just kind of adds to that. So these families come in to have to make all these really difficult decisions. I mean, this is really complex language we talk to them about, and they are sleep deprived. There's sometimes only one patient there and a very dependent child. And yes, you're around medical specialists, so if there's an emergency, they can help clinically, but it's like any mother or father who goes alone to a doctor's visit. It's very overwhelming. So to put the site team in the headspace to just take things a little bit slower with these families. So that sometimes means having visits broken up to a few different days. So don't try to squeeze it all in one day. You're not going to get good feedback from the family or from the child. And go at the family's pace also, but just be aware this might have to take a few days. And be aware that you're going to need some support outside of your team. So most of the hospitals we work with have good child life programs or social work programs. So if we can encourage sites to proactively get those people onto their team, even though it is for a clinical trial, within the hospital setting, those people are usually non-billable. So you can usually get them to come up for any patient, no matter if it's a clinical trial or not. So we try to proactively ask the sites to have those individuals there for the family. So the clinicians that are doing the trial, they are great counselors, but they can kind of step back and do what we need for the clinical trial and have other professionals there to support the family with whatever they need.
CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services is proud to present Moving Medicine Forward. From a small team in an old carriage house to associates in more than 60 countries across the world, CTI is the CRO that does it all. Having worked on more than 10,000 projects, contributed to more than 150 new drug and device approvals, and worked with more than 250 pharmaceutical and emerging biotech companies, our group of innovative thinkers work to change the lives of chronically and critically ill patients. This podcast will give a more in-depth look into the world of clinical research through the eyes of experts in the field. Listen, subscribe, and share as we highlight patient journeys, current trends, and how CTI continues to help move medicine forward.
How has the care and management of his type 1 diabetes changed from beginning to now, and how do you see it changing in the future?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So there's a lot of options out there for diabetes. There's manual injections of insulin, there are insulin pumps, and there's some other new technology. And there's also different manufacturers in all those spaces. And again, that's something I used to do was train people on their devices. So when we started, even though I knew those options were available and my insurance would have covered it right away, and if I wanted my team to be aggressive, they would have been, I wasn't ready to accept that yet. So in retrospect, looking back at this was my first child 15 years ago, I would have been a lot more aggressive. But having other children, doing the work I do, I work full time, my husband works full time, it was a lot slower. So we started with manual injections for about 7 months before we switched to the pump. And again, even though it was covered by insurance, it was just something that we couldn't really take that next step to have more technology and more formulas to consider and stuff. So technology-wise, it's changed a lot and it will continue to change even since we've been in the field or in this space. The size of his devices have all changed. Compatibility has changed. So that is great for him, especially on his little body. So, I mean, I hope in the future it looks a lot different. Working in rare disease, when I would see patients with diseases years and years ago, the idea of gene or cell therapy was out there, but I even thought back then, I'll never see this in my lifetime.
Right.
So now thinking of this and knowing that we work in the diabetes space in some of those very rare treatments, it's like, wow, this is actually could be really doable for him. If it's not ever in his lifetime, what he has is still advanced from 50 years ago. I mean, that's totally different ballgame. So if the new technology comes about, or if, transplantations and things like that come about, I'll be very more open. But we'll just have to see.
Yeah.
It's important to focus on the fact that each patient journey is unique. You talked about you weren't ready to start using the devices right away. So you have to rely on knowing that each patient gets to kind of choose that within the right realm with the expert's input. But how does a chronic management journey differ from a rare disease journey and that patient perspective?
Yeah, I think, well, again, from the patient perspective, when we were talking to sponsors about this and about like the family, what kind of is overwhelming for parents of chronic disease is the idea that you'll be gone and your loved one will still be here.
Mm-hmm.
No matter if it's an adult or a child, at some point you won't be there to manage that. And hopefully when I pass away, my child will be an adult by then, but there's still that fear of who's going to take this over. And even as he grows, I mean, the way that our healthcare system's changing, if insurance changes, all of those things are really real fears for families. I am really fortunate with my insurance, but there are families whose insurance changed next month and they lose all their coverage. So the idea of having to always have that in the back of my head is pretty overwhelming. Like when I was in high school and college, I could just go to school with my backpack and then go to a friend's house and all this, And then in college, I mean, I guess I had insurance right after college, but I could have lapsed it, but now, that there's those kind of fears really are encompassing. And then with diabetes too, the idea of just making sure that he always has accommodations. So like publicly that he can always, bring an extra syringe and bring in food places. And we've had lots of discussions, sometimes heated with people trying to get into those places. So the idea of, will he be able to advocate for himself? And then in the school setting and his work setting. So that's really what weighs on parents.
This was a few years ago, a lot of years ago, but my younger brother, I remember every year we had to start over again with his teacher of like, has extra snacks in his backpack. Sorry. Like he has to do it. Like, so it's forever challenging.
Yes.
But, like, I mean, from my perspective, both my younger brothers, type 1, one was diagnosed when he was 18, one was diagnosed when he was 11. So it's been in our family for a while. Mm-hmm. And like just seeing how they've come, like we didn't have insulin pumps when my younger brother that was 11, like it just wasn't a thing. But now they do. They're both on insulin pumps. So it's super cool to see like the technology move along and I think. But what would be one takeaway that you would give somebody that maybe they just had a kid diagnosed or gets a kid diagnosed in the future? Like give them some tips or things that you learned along the way.
Yeah, I think so. I am not a type A personality, even though most people in my field are. So I'm not someone that needs to be in control usually, but in this space, you feel out of control. You feel like nothing you do is right, and that the other shoe is always kind of waiting to fall. So for new families, I would just let them know that every day will feel totally different, and that is okay. The children aren't feeling it as much as we are. So I would just allow yourself a lot of grace with those ups and downs and allow yourselves to change your mind too. Parents are, at least in my experience, I'm part of different Facebook groups and part of like the advocacy groups. Families are really, really obsessed with making the right choice, the right pump, the right type of insulin, and it changes.
Right.
So, and again, I am more kind of laid back in my general life about that kind of stuff. So I would really tell parents that is so true. Even though you put all the research into it, it might not work out, or you might start using it. It's like, nope, that's not really happening for me. So just a lot of grace to, change course, and a lot of grace with other people too. Again, I have a bad temper, and I know people are very well-intentioned when they ask about this, or sometimes when I try to go to places and they won't let some of those materials in, they're trying to do their jobs too. So kind of grace with other people too. And people have questions. They don't really know the difference between type 1 and type 2. So just understand that when people ask you, it's coming from a good place.
Can you go into a little bit of the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yes, I mean, not clinically, right. But yes, I can. So type 1 diabetes is actually an autoimmune disease. So even when I was growing up, I thought diabetes was just caused by eating cookies. Like, I just thought the kids in our school who couldn't eat cake that was just too much sugar in their bodies. So having an autoimmune disease is a whole lot different. And I think that's more conceptual to people nowadays. There's lots of other chronic diseases out there that are autoimmune. So what happens is the cells within your pancreas are the ones that die essentially, and will always need insulin in that space. And with other, autoimmune diseases too, again, I think it's just more tangible to people now that those are more lifelong experiences. So type 2, clinically, I really will sound dumb here, but type 2 is more influenced by maybe a lifestyle where your body does have too much glucose, maybe from some genetic factors in your own body, plus, maybe not an active lifestyle and having, some diet choices that impact your glucose level. So type 2 is, I would say, curable too. You can get your glucose under control and be fine with no treatment for the rest of your life. For type 1 diabetes, there will never be a time where you will not have to have some kind of treatment.
Right. And patients can be diagnosed with type 1 at any stage. Well, type 1 and type 2. But
yeah, it used to be considered juvenile diabetes. Like, JDRF came from juvenile diabetes. So that came from the idea that it was juvenile. And that's how they used to say, oh, you have juvenile diabetes. But then they eventually started calling it type 1 and type 2. Because like my one brother, he was 18 when he was diagnosed.
Right.
I was like, no, he's got type 1 because he was rail thin when he got diagnosed. But everyone's like, oh, wait, you don't look like you should have diabetes. Like,
I know. That was kind of shook too, the more stories I hear about people later into adulthood. But, if you think about autoimmune diseases in general that, might be caused by an environmental factor or a stress factor, it does make sense, when your body's triggered like that. So, if you're in your 20s and 30s and going through maybe a job change or move across the country and that those stress factors are triggered and it activates your autoimmune disease because you already have the gene for it in your body. It's just a matter of if it wakes up or not. And that can happen at any time in your life.
Yeah. And you mentioned advocacy groups. So how have those played a role in the patient journey and kind of explain to someone who might not know what an advocacy group is?
Yeah. So an advocacy group in general is a group around your disease that is in place to support families. In our world, these groups grow and grow and grow over the years. So some of these groups are really just for emotional support for families, just someone to talk to. Just let me hear what your experience was, or do you have any advice, or what doctor you see? And then there's a whole nother kind of sect of advocacy group that is really based on science and technology and research. So it's true, of course, in all of our rare disease space too, but in diabetes, there's a huge focus on research and development. The Diabetes Association all over the world are very well funded. They are very stable. They have amazing lobbyists all over legislative bodies all over the country. So they are very strong, very connected, which is different from the advocacy groups that I work with. So in rare disease, you're working with a group that was started because one patient was identified with the disease and they didn't know anyone in their entire state or anyone that had this. So they had to just find a lifeline. And that's still true today. I mean, we're working with diseases that are only 200 in the whole world. So you're diagnosed, and you just need to find a lifeline somewhere. So it's definitely a different kind of advocacy group as well. The diabetes groups, not good or bad, but they do definitely have a much more of a corporate feel to their organizations because they do have so much technology and research and money behind them.
But it keeps you in the know of what's going on in the research development field and also the patient journeys. You can, hear other stories and get resources from other personal patient experiences.
Yes. Yeah, they are. The organizations are set up from a national and then more like state level. And they're very appropriate, more at the national level and like the state leads. It's very focused on, is our messaging all aligned? It is information we're giving our patients. Is it correct? Is it a risk? Because we never want to, sway someone's decision either. And then the smaller groups that are really just there for support. That's when you're really asking people, what should I do and what can I do? And it's just where you are in your journey. Sometimes you really want to hear that scientific information, and sometimes you just want to talk to her mom who has to, change schools and needs support.
Right. And how does CTI work with these advocacy groups? Like, we're helping run clinical trials and manage that side, and we work with the sites. How do we work with advocacy groups and bridge that gap?
Yeah, so that is huge for us. So in the rare disease world, one of our biggest challenges is just identifying where all of these patients are. Of course, there's a lot of privacy laws, and patients are seen at all different kind of hospitals all over the state and the country. And we have wonderful relationships with these institutions and these hospitals, but if the one patient we need isn't seen directly at that hospital, that doctor won't know where that patient is either. So it's kind of just a cycle that we can't get out of. So connecting to the advocacy groups where these patients are more than likely to be connected, they're our lifeline to where these patients are and how we can support them. So by going to the advocacy groups, again, the example of maybe only having 200 patients in the world, the groups can say, oh yeah, we do know where these patients are geographically. So it helps us understand where our hospitals and our clinics need to be set up for geographically. And the more important thing is it helps us incorporate the patient's voice into our trial design. So more and more the past few years, and there are FDA guidelines around this now, it is important and mandatory to have the patient's voice represented in your trial design. So what I mean by that is when we design a trial and we know that a drug might work for making you walk faster, whatever it might be. So we know that that's what this drug will do. But the patients are saying, well, I don't really want to walk faster, I want my kid to just be able to sit upright so he can sit in his school desk, all day long. So it's making sure that how we're designing our trials and the information we're collecting is aligned with what the patients want for their loved one as well.
So how is he doing today?
He is, that is a loaded question.
Yeah.
I always appreciate when people say that, but it's just a small moment in time.
Yeah.
So like yesterday was very good. Mm-hmm. He is really unfazed by it. So
that's awesome.
He wears 2 devices. He wears an insulin pump on his leg and a glucose monitor on his arm. And both of those things are implanted. So in a way, it's better than doing shots every few hours, but it is something I'm ripping off his skin and re-injecting. So unless you're really doing those acute things, he doesn't think about it. He's pretty independent. He'll be 7. So he's not at the level of, really caring for any of this himself, but he has to carry around the phone with him and extra supplies with him. Yeah. So he is really accustomed to making sure he has those phones and having the supply. Even when he's playing outside, he can't be more than 30 feet away from the devices. And he's very aware of, it's a fanny pack, we call it his belt. I need to put my belt on. So he's really good with it. And we also take a different approach with his treatment than maybe other families do, that we don't limit his food intake. So we not limit it, but some families will go on a lower carbohydrate diet to keep the glucose levels down. And I totally see where that's coming from, especially from a clinical background. But with other children and with him being so young, we didn't take that approach. So his numbers are definitely still up and down during the day because, if we're on vacation, we have ice cream for breakfast. We all have ice cream for breakfast, so he's really adjusted very well.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was so great to hear about your patient journey and your son and how it is affecting your family and how others can learn from what you've gone through, and we can actually make our trials better by focusing in on the patients and making the patients' lives better.
Thanks for listening to the Moving Medicine Forward podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe to receive updates on all future episodes. Join our journey to advance healthcare by following us on Facebook and Instagram at CTI Facts. This is your host, Raina Graham. Catch you next time.